All right. Okay, so
Has it been working for you?
again, just to be clear, your quiz on Tuesday is just over. Hold on, it's just over this part where it starts with brain and associated structures, and then all the way down and including the sheep brain, all of that. The cranial nerves, you don't need to worry about for the quiz on Tuesday. You definitely need to worry about the cranial nerves for the lecture exam on Thursday, and you'll definitely need to worry about the cranial nerves for the practical, but not for the quiz. So let me go through all this stuff. I'll start with the plastic model, then I will go on to the sheep brain, and I'm going to try to kind of work my way from outside to in. So I'm just going to kind of talk, I'm going to try to hit all the high points, but I'm just going to sort of talk off the cuff as opposed to just constantly looking at the sheet. But if there's something I say and it's not listed in the lab guide, you know, you don't need to know it. I do stand by that. So it's just that I know, I just have such a vast wealth of knowledge that I sometimes just say things and I just, I know so much that I just sometimes talk. All right, anyway, so this thing, just to get your bearings looking from the outside, this is the longitudinal fissure going right down the midline. Keep in mind that inside, like a real brain, if like the meninges were on here, there'd be this big divider called the falx cerebri that's running down there. So that's the biggest kind of divider, the longitudinal fissure. There's also a fissure that cuts across here that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. That would be the transverse fissure. And inside there is an extension of the dura mater called the tentorium cerebelli that kind of acts like a shelf. And then over on the side here, that little line that you see there, that's called the lateral cerebral sulcus, and that kind of separates the temporal lobe down here from the frontal and the parietal lobe up there. Coming across, let's see here, it's always hard to see on these models, but like roughly right here and kind of working its way across, that would be the central sulcus. That's that kind of important divider. So if you're in front of that, like here, or just this whole thing in front, you'd be in the frontal lobe. If you're posterior to it, you'd be in the parietal lobe. If you're over here, you're in the temporal lobe. And then obviously if you're way back in this area, you're in the occipital lobe. Other stuff that you can see from the outside. So I am going to take this apart in a second. I just want to try to cover everything I can. If you flip the brain on the underside like this, this is a great view that shows you a lot of the cranial nerves. We're not going to have to worry about those right now. Although there are some, let me just make sure here. I don't see it on here, but maybe it's someplace. Oh, well, it is for the sheep brain. Anyway, these things that you see here, this guy here and this guy over here, that's actually cranial nerve number 1. That's the olfactory nerve. It is listed under the sheep brain. I don't know if I see it on the other part. I don't know where it is. Yeah, I don't know. I don't see it on the other part. So they sometimes call this, you could call this the olfactory nerve, or they also call it the olfactory bulb. The other cranial nerve that you, at least in a structure you need to be able to identify, is this thing sitting back here. That's called the optic chiasm. It kind of looks like the letter X. It actually represents where cranial, where the optic nerve crosses sides. Okay, I'm only bringing that up because again, that is listed under, I think, the sheep brain, and then it's listed. I don't see it listed up at the top part. Anyway, other stuff you can see before I pull this model apart. Everything from like here on down, this whole area is going to be brainstem. This obviously is the cerebellum back here. The rest of the stuff is the cerebrum. You can't really see the diencephalon from the outside because it's deep, inside. This part from here on down is going to be the medulla. This part here that's kind of bulging would be the pons, and then way up high in there would be the midbrain. I will show you a separate model that just shows you the brainstem, and it's easier to see. This, of course, is the pituitary. It's hanging basically underneath where the hypothalamus is. If I look on the back side of the brain, again, this would be the right cerebellar hemisphere, and this is the left cerebellar hemisphere. Make sure you spell, cerebellar hemisphere for these guys, and you spell cerebral hemisphere for these guys that are up here, because they are different things. And then this little thing that you see in the middle of the cerebellum, that kind of supposed to look sort of like an earthworm, that's the vermis. It's right in the center there. All right, I'm still not going to pull it apart yet. Before I pull it apart, I want to show you this model. This is the model I mentioned that just basically shows the brainstem alone. They've removed the cerebrum. They've also removed the cerebellum. Just to get your bearings, here's a separate cerebellum. Right, there's a separate. This would basically be sitting on like this, on the back of this, okay? But they've removed it so you can see kind of the brainstem alone. If you look at the front of the brainstem, again, everything from here down is the medulla. This bulging area is the pons. And then this area that's kind of high up and hard to see, that's going to be the midbrain. Now on the front of the midbrain, you see these structures here called cerebral peduncles. They're kind of on the side, the front and sort of the sides of the midbrain, you have these cerebral peduncles. If you flip the midbrain on the back, that's when you should see those 4 bumps. So this whole thing represents the corpora quadrigemina. That's all 4 bumps. The 2 upper bumps here and there, those are called the superior colliculi. And then the 2 lower bumps here and there, that's called the inferior colliculi. Sitting right above it, sort of separated, this model isn't really, I think these pieces actually were from separate models, which is why they're not fitting together so closely. But this one red thing that you have kind of above the corpora quadrigemina, that's supposed to be the pineal gland. Looking at this posterior view, again, the cerebellum would be sitting right here, but if you remove the cerebellum, this thing that you see here is actually the 4th ventricle. That's the inside of the 4th ventricle. 4th ventricle is sandwiched in between the pons and the cerebellum. Okay. All right, so let me now finally at last pull the brain apart and show you the stuff that's on the inside. Oh, you know what? Sorry, I'm still not going to do that yet. I'm waiting. One thing I wanted to show you was the meninges. Some people were asking about the meninges. I don't have a good model of the meninges. All the plastic models that we have the meninges removed. So if I want to ask you about the meninges, I'll have to use pictures kind of like this one that were from the PowerPoint. Again, the meninges are basically the same setup that you had around the spine. The outermost meninge, which is in green, would be the dura mater. The middle meninge that's in purple would be the arachnoid mater. Underneath the arachnoid mater, where you see kind of these little fibers, that would be the subarachnoid space. And then this red line that's directly attached to the brain itself, that'd be the pia mater. Okay? So all that stuff. Also on this view, something that you're seeing are these little guys. These are the arachnoid villi, and those are the guys where the CSF gets put back into the blood, right? So those are important for that function. One thing to note about the dura mater, you don't really need to know this for the lab quiz or anything, but you do need to know it for the lecture exam. Just remember that the dura mater around the brain actually has 2 separate layers. There's an outer periosteal layer, and then there's an inner meningeal layer. You didn't have that around the spinal cord, but you do have it around the brain. Again, it's not listed in your lab guide. You don't have to worry about it for lab purposes, but I just want to point that out. The other thing that I can't really show you, well, I can, but let me show you this anyway, are the ventricles. You can see the ventricles on the plastic model. I'll show them to you, but I think it's nice to get a view like this where you can kind of see the big picture kind of projected. So on a sideways view of the brain, you'd have these two big things that look kind of like the letter C. Those are going to be the lateral ventricles. Then they both sort of connect then in the midline with this one third ventricle. So that's the third ventricle there. That third ventricle is sitting right in the middle of the diencephalon. It's surrounded by the thalamus and by the hypothalamus and all that stuff. So it's right in the midline. And for those of you that cut the sheep brain, you actually, when you cut through that longitudinal fissure, you just cut right through the middle of that third ventricle, right? This passageway that you see going back here, that's the aqueduct of Sylvius, or you can call it the aqueduct of the midbrain, or you can call it the cerebral aqueduct. Then this thing here would be the fourth ventricle. Those are some of those little openings that are in the fourth ventricle that allow the CSF to get into the subarachnoid space. And then this thing that continues down here, that would be the central canal of the spinal cord. This is a front-on view of the ventricles. So on this, kind of similar to that drawing I did the other day, these would be like the lateral ventricles here and there. And then this thing in the middle would be the third ventricle. This would be the cerebral aqueduct traveling down there. This would then be the fourth ventricle. And then this would be the central canal that's going down into the spinal cord. You can also actually on this thing see the little arachnoid villi that are sitting up there inside of that dual venous sinus. All right, now let me go into the actual inside of the brain. By pulling this model apart. So if you separate this model like this, pull it apart, you can see a lot of stuff on this like mid-sagittal section. So everything from up here all the way down, all of this is part of the brainstem. Then obviously here you've got the cerebellum. All of this stuff up here is the cerebrum. And then this area in here is the diencephalon. So looking at the brainstem, it's pretty obvious you can see the bulging thing there. So that's kind of a good landmark. That's going to be the pons. So from there on down, it's going to be the medulla, then the pons, and then above the pons, in this little area here, you have the midbrain. If you look posterior to the pons, you'll actually find this little space here. That's going to be the fourth ventricle. Then back here, you have the cerebellum. Again, if you look up close to the cerebellum has the same design as the cerebrum. There's going to be gray matter on the outside, and that's called the cerebellar cortex. And then there's white matter on the inside that, I don't know, some artsy-fartsy type of person called it the tree of life, right? The arbor vitae, right? The white part there. As you go up into the midbrain, in other words, up in here, that's where, number one, you can see this coming through here. That's the aqueduct of Sylvius, or the aqueduct of the midbrain, or the cerebral aqueduct, whatever you want to call it. I don't really care. But back here would be those bumps. So, you know, you'll see the superior colliculi up here, the inferior colliculi right below it. Obviously, this is only one half, so this would be like the left superior and inferior colliculi, and then when I put the other half together, you'd have the right superior and inferior colliculi. This whole thing is the epithalamus, but the part that you're going to be asked about is just the little end here, and that's the pineal gland that's sitting right there. As for the diencephalon, back this up just a little bit. That's that kind of rough, if you can sort of see it, envision it there, that rough kind of egg-shaped thing, that's the thalamus. And then this area down that's below it is the hypothalamus. And then you can see hanging off of the hypothalamus by a little stalk is the pituitary gland. When this is in place inside of your cranial bones, of course, that pituitary is going to be sitting right in that sella turcica, the Turkish saddle, right? Now, in the middle of the diencephalon, right here where my probe is, that's where the third ventricle would be. So right, in there is the third ventricle, and then it's surrounded by the diencephalon. If you kind of follow your way up into this little space up here, that would be where the lateral ventricles are going to be. And then this big thing that you see coming across here, that's the corpus callosum, and that's where you have a lot of those commissural tracts that will cross from the left, where axons cross from the left to the right or from the right to the left. Okay. All right, that's pretty much it for the plastic model. Now let me show you the stuff on the sheep brain. And let's see here, make sure I can get this. So here's a sheep brain, and obviously you can see the cerebrum here, and then you see the cerebellum back here. If you turn it over to the underside, all of this stuff in here is going to be the brain stem, except when you get right down here, you're actually getting into the start of the spinal cord, right, when you're down there. Again, make sure you know the main fissure. So this is the longitudinal fissure right there. This fissure that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum, that would be the transverse fissure. And other stuff you can see from the outside. It's sometimes a little hard to make out, but like right across, it looks like right across here would be the central sulcus. The central sulcus is kind of forward in the sheep brain. It's not quite as central as it is in humans. So that would be the central sulcus, which means that if you're up like in this area, you're in the frontal lobe. If you're immediately behind it, you're like in the parietal lobe. If you're off to the side, like down here, you're in the temporal lobe. And then if you're back here, you're in the occipital lobe. Other stuff you can see on the underside of the sheep brain, you can see, well, not super well, but focus it. This here, and also, well, it kind of got messed up over there. That's the olfactory bulb. That's that first cranial nerve, okay? So you should be able to identify that. This thing, which actually you can see it on the sheep brain better than the plastic model, that's that X-shaped thing. That's called the optic chiasm. That's the spot where cranial nerve number 2, which is your optic nerve, which connects to your eyeballs, that's where it crosses sides, okay, at that optic chiasm. Again, the rest of this stuff down here is mostly brainstem. It's a little tricky to see. The pons is relatively small in the sheep brain, but it looks kind of like this would be the pons right here, which would mean that then here down would be the medulla. Then you're actually seeing the start of the spinal cord down there. If you're up above, like in this area, you would be in the midbrain. Back here is the cerebellum. If you kind of push it together, that thing that's in the middle there would be like the vermis. Now, the thing that's kind of cool is if you sort of hold, actually, let me see, is this the one I want to look at? Actually, I'm going to try it on this one because it's easier. This one wasn't split apart yet. If you hold the cerebrum together and then pull down on the cerebellum and look inside, that's where you should see the corpora quadrigemina, okay? Now, I know, again, it helps if you have an imagination, but that would be that'd be the left superior colliculi, that would be the right superior colliculi, that would be the left inferior colliculi, and that would be the right inferior colliculi. So if you notice, the inferior colliculi, they're kind of smaller than the superior colliculi are, but altogether, you would refer to the whole thing as the corpora quadrigemina. And if you look above it, right in the midline, that little thing is the pineal gland sitting up there. Okay? All right, back to my cut version. So let me pull this apart then. And if I pull it apart and look at it like this then, let's see here. Yeah, good enough. So, to get your bearings, obviously there's the cerebellum, there's the cerebrum up there. From here on down to like there, that's going to be the brainstem. And then this little part up in there is going to be the diencephalon. If you look at the brainstem, it's kind of hard to see. I'll be honest with you, but you can definitely see kind of this edge up here where there's an indentation. So that's kind of the top of the pons. The bottom of the pons, there's also an indentation, but it's much more subtle. I'd call it to be like right about there. So that means that this little thing, that'd be the pons. The pons is a lot smaller in the sheep brain than it is in us, but that would be the pons. And then that would mean everything from here down would be the medulla until you get into here where this would be like the spinal cord. Okay. If you're above it in this area, then you're in the midbrain. If you look, you can see the cerebellum, you can see the gray matter, which is the cerebellar cortex, and then the white matter, which is the arbor vitae. If you kind of gently pull the cerebellum away from like the pons and the rest, this space in here would actually be like where the fourth ventricle is. This space that's coming through here is going to be the cerebral aqueduct, or the aqueductus sylvius, whatever you want to call it. These two things here and there, those are the superior and inferior colliculi. So again, if you can envision it, with it put together with the other half, right, it would look like this, and you'd have those 4 bumps. So when they're not together, that's going to be the superior colliculi, and then down here would be the inferior colliculi. This little thing is the pineal gland. So you can see the pineal gland is pretty easy to spot. This, which looks kind of round, if you can kind of see that edge coming around there, you kind of got this round-shaped structure. That would be the thalamus, which then means this area down here would be the hypothalamus. This thing that you see here is part of that optic chiasm where the optic nerve cross sides. So again, if I put the half back, you can see how it fits in there to form that thing that kind of looks like the letter X, which is the optic chiasm. Okay. And then last thing, last two things, inside here, that would be like, I've unfortunately kind of destroyed it a little bit, but that would be the inside of the lateral ventricle, right in there. And then this is what I unfortunately kind of messed up, but that's going to be the corpus callosum that's going across there. That's the crossing over side for the axons. Okay. That's about it. Any questions about either the plastic model or the sheep brain or any of that stuff? All right, good luck. Again, this is the last quiz, so that's good, right?